This is 287 acres that I've lived on and owned for 24 years. Includes about 40 acres of wetlands, beaver ponds, various types of wetlands, and a large, extensive, steep slope, rocky ridge area. It is a place to live. It's a place also for me to practice silviculture and forestry, to experiment without having to be responsible or beholden to anybody else. So it's a nice little experimental forest in that way. And I also depend on it for timber revenue. Feel very strongly about protecting the wetlands here. All the water for these wetlands, except one seasonal stream, originates on this property. So it is its own little mini watershed, which is really kind of a cool study. So it's like everything else in life, and especially forestry. There's an evolution, and constantly adapting to what we see for outcomes and results of work. And I don't necessarily see it all as timber harvesting. I see the logging as a tool to accomplish various objectives, and it's just one of many tools, but one that we depend on quite heavily. So not everything can be done accomplished via logging, but some work can be. So the forest was heavily high graded by these developers before, and they cut the best, left the rest. Sometimes that was okay. It didn't, long term it was okay, and other times it's, I'm still dealing with that after 40 years probably, and it's a long-term process. So I don't know exactly what the disposition is here of the property after I die. It has an easement on it, so there's a level of protection. But whoever has it, whether it's my two daughters or whether it's somebody else, I would like it to be a healthy, vibrant forest supporting a lot of bird life, wildlife diversity, high quality water and related habitats, as well as be able to be a source of revenue over time too.
So we're out here, we're still at Frost Forest, and we are at one of Ehrhard's inventory points, which is shown by this orange black locust stake. Ehrhard, before we start talking about what you do at an inventory point, or about this specific inventory point, can you tell us a little bit more about, just in general, what does a forester do?
Sure. Now that my glasses are all fogged up, but I don't need them to talk. So, foresters, as the name probably implies, deal with forests, and there's a number of different types of foresters, ranging from the research academic foresters that research how our forests develop and grow and various influences on them, human and otherwise. Academics that teach and do research. There are foresters that work for the public. There are state foresters that generally are involved with state land management. There are county foresters in the various counties in the various states that are all function differently and have different affiliations. And Vermont Forest Parks and Rec foresters are county foresters, and they're also state foresters. In New Hampshire, county foresters work under the auspices of the Cooperative Extension Service, part of UNH. There are industrial foresters whose job it is to supply mills with material, manage company lands, And there are consulting foresters like myself that are responsible to our clients, have a fiduciary and agency responsibility to them to protect their interests and the interests of their forests, and who are involved with advising landowners, private, sometimes industrial, municipal, organizations like Upper Valley Land Trust, Nature Conservancy, and others, Vermont Land Trust, on the management of their land or interacting with them in some way. And, you know, that takes various forms in terms of what we actually do. You know, we get involved with boundary location and marking and maintenance. We are involved with inventorying and determining conditions of the forest, evaluating the forest, and prescribing treatments to landowners based on their goals and objectives. Those have to be informed not just by what the landowner wants, but also by what the sites we're dealing with are, you know, support for forests, what is realistic, and what can we reasonably expect from our forests without over asking. So that's, you know, so there's inventory, and then there's implementation in terms of various treatments to tend and work within the forest and accomplish those goals and objectives. So invasive control work has come into play now with the, you know, with the vast spread of those species that we've seen.
So at each one of those points, when you come out and collect data,
Correct.
What is it that you're collecting at each point?
So we collect regeneration data, number of stems by species, and then that is ultimately stems per acre by species is what the final outcome is.
That's for regeneration?
For regeneration.
So that tells you what's coming up. That'll be the next forest.
Should be. We also rank the regeneration as whether it's free to grow, partially free to grow, or not free to grow, so whether it can actually develop.
Yeah.
And we also rank browse. The browse here is uniformly severe on hardwoods. Mm-hmm. We have beech that is browsed. So when beech is browsed and non-preferred species, we have problems. And then the overstory, or what's called the featured stand, the main canopy in this case, we also tally using a 10-factor basal area prism, and we tally by species, diameter, whether it's acceptable or unacceptable growing stock, crown classes, and then we estimate products in the tree. Those products will vary depending on the market situation, whatever. But at a minimal, saw logs and pulpwood, sometimes veneer, saw logs, pallet logs, mat logs, pulpwood, whatever. It all that flexes with the market a little bit.
Yeah.
But we gather all that data. It gives us a good look at the stand and the conditions. We can correlate crown position with quality, crown position with species. Mm-hmm. So it gives us a good look.
Yep.
So this, at this particular sample, you know, we've got a really dense understory of fir with some hemlock, beech, which is what survives without, you know, the deer browse. And we've got an overstory of pine, and I've got the plot data right here. And this is a 14-inch spruce, actually 14.2 inches. And the bigger pine around here that you see ranges from 18 to 26 inches. And I've got a couple notes about weak crowns or poor crowns. I have some that have double tops. So the trick here from a management standpoint in terms of a timber perspective, is to keep this next generation growing and developing by feeding it some light, and thereby harvesting some of this larger, mature, nearly mature, whatever, older overstory. And generally speaking, personally, I don't want to sacrifice high quality overstory for a younger developing understory. But if your overstory is mature or nearing maturity, however that's defined, there's a lot of ways to define that, or it's poor quality and I've got good quality, well-stocked, a younger stand underneath it, then I need to face the music, so to speak, and harvest that older component to release the younger one, always keeping in mind structure, vertical structure, horizontal diversity, attributes like cavities that can be used by various birds and mammals, future down material. I like to leave trees that have dead tops but live lower limbs because they're great perch sites for songbirds and raptors. So it's trying to balance those other factors with just the timber production end of things.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question, Ehrhard?
Yeah.
So you've kind of spoken on this when you talked about what a forester does and also leaving good habitat for different animals, but why do all of this management, why do that instead of just, won't nature just take care of it itself? Like, what's the point of us stepping in and trying to help?
Well, first of all, foresters wouldn't have a job. That's a big thing. But, seriously, I tell landowners that I work with all the time that if you don't want something from your forest, whatever that might be, or some things from your forest, you don't need to do anything. The only caveat there nowadays is probably invasives, because they are impacting our natural forests and other plant life and and all the wildlife that depend on them to a pretty large degree in places, whether they're whether you're looking at a managed forest or unmanaged. There are certain situations where you have really dense stands, especially softwood, especially hemlock, that they just don't allow anything to develop under them, including invasives. So, but most landowners want something from their forest land. They want an aesthetically pleasing forest land. They want to, it's very common for landowners to say, I want to leave it better than the way I found it, however we define better. They want a healthy forest. People are more and more aware of impacts of invasives, of climate change. Certainly emerald ash borer has put invasive insects and their impact on the radar. And people realize that though natural forests have their place, and we have areas within almost every property that I work on that are managed, and other areas within that are not, for whatever reasons. And the two can mix together, and then there are other areas where it's appropriate to have unmanaged forests so that we can, especially in the face of climate change, see how these forests are going to develop, because all the historical information is kind of going off the charts now. So it's important to be able to track impacts of climate on how our native forests develop and change in the various soil types, sites, and forest types we deal with. There are also areas in the forest that you're not going to improve anything. You may do more harm than good to soil and water, and you're going to have a negligible, if any, value on improving what's there or making something grow better or be healthier, however you want to define it. So why risk the negative impact? That's, kind of that kind of do no harm thing, that doctors use is a very similar situation. Not to say there's not impacts when we do things in the forest. There are, but you try to mitigate the negative, and definitely want the positive to be the overpowering one, and you live with a little short-term negative and then move on. So we've treated portions of these areas, taking out lower quality species. It was high graded before, where they took out the most valuable, better trees, and I left a number of these hardwoods, both for structure and wildlife, but also for seed. And because of our high deer populations and the severe browse that results, we don't have hardwood regeneration, we have softwood. At this elevation, we have a line around here that at a certain elevation and below, it tends to be balsam fir. Balsam fir tends to be a cooler climate species. And on the upper slopes, especially the warmer west slopes, we then tend to transition to more hardwoods, especially oak, red maple, and others. So it just, we'll look at other examples of kind of silvicultural treatments, the goal and objective of those, and then the results. Yeah. And sometimes it was good and sometimes it wasn't. So after the cutting that was done in, when it was high graded back in the 70s or whatever, the deer population back then wasn't what it is now. And it's a little frustrating to to have done what should work and have it not work. So we need to adapt. You need to evaluate. You can't, and I don't spend as much time here as I'd like to, though I hope to be spending more time here as I get old and decrepit. But you can't just, as a forester, you have a responsibility, I believe. You can't just go in, prescribe a treatment, implement that treatment, and walk away for 10 or 15 or 20 years and then come back and say, oh, that didn't work. After you've repeated the same thing and not had it work for those intervening years. We have to be adaptive. It's even always critical, but more critical now with things like climate change, invasive insects, invasive plants. Yeah. Just way more critical. Yeah. But this is a gap that was created.
So you created this gap about 13, 14 years ago.
Yeah, roughly.
And this pine came in.
It came in or was here and responded.
And jumped.
To the light.
Yep.
So now, a typical, there's this gap dynamics in that's a natural, it's a natural thing, a gap gets created by a single tree or group of trees falling or by trees being cut. And typically over time, naturally, that gap expands because now the surrounding trees are a little more vulnerable to things like wind damage or ice. So silviculture tries to emulate and modify slightly, work with those natural dynamics. And so now we would, what we call, expand the gap and take out some of the trees immediately around or above this regeneration. And that's what I'm going to do. We're going to leave some of them. I'm going to take some of them. There gets to a point where the trees that are left now are going to need to be cut, or you're going to lose potentially lose volume, or if a natural disturbance comes along, you've got a lot to lose when you lose a 26-inch tree that's, 50 feet merchantable logs in it. You've got, versus a 12-inch tree or a 10-inch tree. But
And so you can make some of those decisions based on the data that you've collected at the inventory points. And then now that you know what treatment you're going to apply here next time, then when you come back and inventory that point again after the harvest, you'll be able to tell whether your intended outcome is happening, right? You'll be able to tell if removing some of the edge trees from this gap is releasing these
Right.
trees to grow.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you'll have the data to back that up.
Yeah, and you'll also be able to see whether your residual featured trees, main canopy, are growing or not, or declining. You'll be able to evaluate crown
Vigor.
depth and
Yep.
live crown ratio. You'll be able to see growth, whether there is or isn't a response. So sometimes when things go too long, you can provide more light and it's too late. Some trees can respond better than others.
Yep.
And other trees, once they slow down, they're on the highway to, what's that song? Anyway.
So Ehrhard, we're at a different part of your forest. You've done some work here in past years. I'm wondering if you can talk about what the treatment that you used here was intended to do, and then whether that happened or not, and what you might do next.
Sure. I believe we implemented what would, you could probably call it a thinning from below, in which hemlock, there was a fair bit of hemlock below this overstory of hardwood, and that was taken out. I didn't think of it so much as a thinning to release and encourage the growth and development of the hardwood, because it was below that. So it's a little bit tough trying to define that from a silvicultural perspective. I did hope that the canopy gaps that we opened up would be sufficient to establish hardwood regeneration of the variety of species we have in the overstory. Sugar maple, red maple, yellow birch, paper birch to a lesser degree. There's not really much oak right here. And what happened, as you can see, is we have softwood regeneration, a combination of some fir. Most of that was here before, given the height and the number of whorls, and white pine, which was largely not here before. This was done with a cut-to-length system with a forwarder, moving wood out, so not too much ground disturbance. It was done bare ground, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure, because we had a turkey nest down below here, and I modified the area of the cut and kept a buffer around that, because there was a nest there with some number of eggs, which they did hatch out and fledge, or they don't fledge because they're precocious. They go right from the get-go. But anyway, they were there, and we got a bunch of pine in, and there's no reason we shouldn't have got any, these hardwoods in. And the only thing that myself and others can figure out is, again, severe deer browse. The population of deer is so high that anything that comes in, they eat. They eat the beech last. They even will gnaw on that. And so there's some seed source downhill of white pine. It's a light seed, so it'll travel. There's not really. There's some maybe 300 feet over there, 500 feet. But you would expect normally for hardwood to come in under this, and it came in pine. And one problem is pine itself is not an issue. It's normally not what the progression would be. So these yellow birch are nothing to write home about. I left them to drop seed in this opening. Now I know we got some snow, but I can tell you right now, there ain't enough yellow birch in here to matter, if any.
Yeah. Yep.
And why? Because they eat it. The deer eat it.
But there's also no pine in here. Just on the edges, there's a few.
Yep.
So that's an odd thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why. But
A little wet.
typically,
It's a little wet right here, right?
it might be. But yellow birch likes it on the wetter side. Not wet,
But the pine wouldn't, right?
Nah, I mean, I've seen pine grow in swamps too, but yeah. But the point is that this is not a big canopy gap or opening, but it should, in quotes, something should come in here and develop.
Within an economic way, you'd need to be looking at more like a tree service, there's so many other considerations. There's also many impediments depending on the size of the trees, and if you're cutting down large trees, how to remove them effectively. Basal area can still be used as a guide for stocking or density of the stand, but again, it's not 2 acres is like not enough critical mass to be a forest. It's got trees on it, but it's not, it really, with all the house site and the driveway and septic systems or sewer lines or wells and all the other accoutrements, it's really pretty tough to work around. So again, you can still use those principles to make selections and determinations of what trees you'd like to leave and what trees you'd like to remove to accomplish whatever your particular objectives are. But it's a kind of a different, it's more like it's bordering on, again, treescaping, landscaping, almost urbanish, suburbanish forestry.
All right. This question is from Peg Marins. You spoke a bit about adapting in the face of deer browse, invasives, and climate change. Could you expand a bit more on additional adaptation steps that will be necessary going forward to maintain the health and benefits of Upper Valley forests?
So this is about impacts of climate change and adaptations that need to occur?
Yeah, she's asking about deer browse, invasives, and climate change, but you could focus on any one of those and talk about adaptation.
So again, to the deer browse issue, I believe in the area that I work, which is largely in the Connecticut River Valley, both Vermont, New Hampshire, and several towns either side of the valley towns, that the high deer populations and the resulting severe deer browse have created a 20 to 30 year void in hardwood regeneration. And so we are lacking that age class and that size class. We're lacking those trees that will become the future forest. We're also seeing a shift in composition where, as I mentioned in the video, where you would typically succeed, where hardwood should be able to succeed themselves, or where an old field that developed with white pine typically will succeed itself and move to hardwoods. Sometimes a mix of hardwood hemlock, and it all depends on the site. But we're not seeing that. So we've got a kind of an interruption or a modification of what composition our forest would be typically. And we've also got this void, this lack of a certain size and age of trees because of the deer. In terms of climate, you know, I think the best that we can do is try to maintain as much diversity in the forest as we can, both from a composition standpoint, different species, and also from various ages, so that, you know, if something, you know, our disturbance regimes are changing, we're seeing higher frequencies and intensities of varying disturbances, whether it's wind, rain combination, possibly ice, and those are all going to have an impact. I don't see climate impacting the actual ability so much of the forest to regenerate, but it will moving forward, I think, impact the composition. And so we need to be aware of what species are predicted to do well in the changing climate scenarios that are out there and which ones aren't. And sugar maple, red spruce, balsam fir, yellow birch, paper birch are all not predicted to fare very well in a warming climate. White pine, red maple, red oak, white oak, the hickories, which are white oak and the hickories are more of a southern, you know, southern Vermont, New Hampshire, and New England composition, but you know, they're moving north, so they move slowly. They can't move like animals can, but it's happening. So does that answer the question? Kind of.
Any thoughts on what we could do about any of this? Or, I mean, you know, controlling deer populations for deer browse, or?
So it's, you know, the warming climate's a double-edged sword. You know, longer growing seasons mean, you know, all plant life's going to grow longer. We have, I think we've gained something like 10 degree days or 10 days in the growing season in the last 20 plus years or something. Of course, there's going to be variations year to year, but overall, so, you know, that's going to mean plant life, including trees, are going to, you know, they're going to have more time to grow. Invasives, I think, you know, there'll be conditions that are conducive for them to continue to proliferate, and I don't think the warming climate's going to help with the deer issue. You know, we'll have greater survival rate in the wintertime because we won't have winters that are as harsh, so there are going to be more deer around, and you know, at a point there's just not enough for them to eat. I mean, that's really what the problem is now. There's either too many deer or not enough food. That's the problem. Not everywhere. I mean, there's places where the climate is different, and you know, the spine of the Green Mountains and maybe way up in parts of the Northeast Kingdom, that's not true. But in the River Valley here, certainly in the Champlain Valley, it's true. So in terms of invasives, I mean, invasives respond to disturbance. Now, they also can invade undisturbed areas, but they will always, like any plant, respond to more light, to better, to some soil scarification and disturbance. They're always going to respond to that, whether it's from a natural event or whether it's from human implemented events. So that's always in play, and they also have seeds that remain viable for a long time, 3 to 7 years, depending on the species. That's a long time. Not many of our native trees have that kind of longevity in terms of viability. Balsam fir does, but a lot of other species don't. They either germinate pretty quickly or it's all over. So. Jason, stop laughing.
All right, let's move on to another question from Kathy McGrath. This question is, in a forest managed for recreation purposes, hiking, Nordic skiing, snow machines, limited ATVs, can one ensure that logging roads do not negatively affect the aesthetic as well as the health of the forest? So
Aesthetics are all in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, what looks good to me may not look good to you. And it's even the cleanest timber harvest can be considered somewhat messy. And it's kind of like when you're building a house, it's a nightmare around the construction site, but you know, when everything's all said and done, and everything's cleaned up and everything's graded, and you know, you have a little time for everything to settle in, it's great. But I've had tours with folks on forests that I've managed for 30 or 40 years, and we're looking at places and people say, oh, this has never been cut. I said, oh yes it has, look at the stumps. So you know, our forests are, you know, they're dynamic, they're living ecosystems. Trees are always falling down, trees are dying. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And, you know, I think a lot of the forests that I work in are very aesthetically pleasing. They may not always be, again, during a harvest or right after a harvest, but, you know, I think that you can enhance that. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. And I think we do have to be careful about whether it's for timber production or for aesthetics or anything else, of over homogenizing the forest. And I also think we have to be careful and realize that they are dynamic living ecosystems, and you know, aren't kind of just, I don't mean sterile it's not sterile at all, but you know, they're not just pretty backdrops. It's not a park. It's a lot more complex and dynamic than that. So, but yeah, I mean, we, you know, recreation and aesthetics is not an unusual landowner objective, and one that we accommodate as much as we possibly can. But again, when it comes down to it, it's all like, if you want everything neat and tidy and all the branches raked up and, you know, whatever, I mean, that's landscaping, that's treescaping. So.
all right, we've had a couple of questions. I'm going to read two of them that are sort of in the same vein here. So one from Mark, could you provide a very brief summary update as to the current status of the market for low-grade timber? i.e., is it currently economically viable to host these operations? Is the future looking grim, positive, somewhat in between? General thoughts as to the value of keeping those operations viable. And then another person, William Maloney, how do you see the market for low-grade forest products? Is that is the biomass or pulp markets? So kind of the same question.
So, you know, markets have changed incredibly since when I started working in the Upper Valley in 1976. So back then, nobody, especially south of here, nobody shipped pulpwood anywhere. There were no markets for pulpwood. The only thing that was harvested were logs. And there was that ranged from very high quality logs to low quality logs, but that's what was harvested. And until Elmendorf board was built in Claremont, which was an oriented strand board plant that provided a market for softwood, for white pine, spruce, fir, and aspen, popple, whatever. There were no local markets for that low grade wood. So it was difficult to accomplish improvement in the stands in terms of timber quality without those low grade markets. Since the advent of Elmendorf, and then also since the advent of whole tree chipping, that has made it more possible to do that to a large degree. And because Elmendorf was here, then people saw, okay, well, we can get rid of this wood. So there was pressure then to utilize the mills in Ticonderoga and Glens Falls, New York, or Jay, Maine, or Berlin, New Hampshire at the time, and some concentration yards for mills over in S.D. Warren's mill. I think they're now Sappy Paper. Anyway, so it's like then people, then you had to move that wood too. It had to be part of the mix. And, that was a good thing, but we're transporting that low grade wood, a long, long ways. It's, it's 100 miles to Berlin, and it's not an easy road, especially when you're driving a tractor trailer. Chip markets are tough now. There's some people in that business who think they're not going to be here in 5 years, and that it's not my favorite harvesting method, but it's a method that allows us to economically harvest material that you can't otherwise harvest and improve stand quality in that way without leaving a huge amount of material on the ground. That woody material is great from an ecological standpoint, but you have to at some point question how much is enough. With 90 tons per acre, can anybody imagine 90 tons per acre of wood on the ground? I recently spoke with younger friends who are my kids' age, and they had a harvest done, and they can't even access their forest now because all the pulpwood was left, all the tops were left. They were cut, their stand was improved, but now it is, they just can't maneuver and walk through their wood. So if you're looking for any aesthetic or recreational aspect there, that creates problems when you can't access your own forest and enjoy it and be out in it and do whatever you do out there. It's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So
all right, I have a somewhat of a technical question, which is from Peter Martin. Do you do anything to manage the new dense growth? I'm assuming that is after a cut. Peter, if you want to expand on that question, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, we can manage at all stages, and those activities in younger stands are known as pre-commercial or non-commercial treatments or tending activities. It's kind of like weeding the garden. Weeding and thinning is a common tool used in young stands to weed. So that you're controlling composition in that case. So you're weeding out and choosing which species you want and which you don't, or thinning to provide space and room for those other trees that you're retaining to grow. It's no different than the garden, and it's a lot more complex than a garden, but when you plant carrots, you have to thin them. You're either going to have a whole bunch of little carrots, or you thin them out and you grow larger carrots. So you have fewer carrots, but they're larger. The same thing applies in the forest. You cannot grow on any given site any more volume on that site. It's the amount of mass that you can grow, biomass, carbon, however you want to term it, that's all there is. You don't have any more capacity. So you can either grow a lot of little trees, or you can grow fewer bigger trees. And when stands are initiated, when they regenerate, there's tens of thousands of trees per acre to start with. When you're down to the stage when they're 20, 24, 26 inches or whatever, you're looking at a couple hundred, 250, 300. So they're going to sift themselves out naturally, or we can aid that process. So yeah, we work in stands, and I work in stands all the time that are young stands. I'm working in some balsam fir at my place now that is from 4 to 8 inches in diameter, and thinning that out. So.
Okay, I think this one is a good follow-up to that. This is from Shannon. I don't know how to say your last name, Shannon, I'm sorry. How do you think that balancing, or how do you think about balancing the various levels or targets of focus in space and time, individual trees, stands of trees, whole forests, continents, years, decades, centuries, millennia, which I think
I
is an
didn't hear the
interesting
beginning
question.
of that, Allison.
I think what her question is, how are you setting goals and balancing your various goals between like looking at an individual stand of trees or a forest of trees right now or in 10 years versus looking out 100 years or 500 years.
Well, I'm not looking out 500 years. It's obviously a lot of variables out that far, but I certainly look out and try to think about, not just the current expected life of the trees now, but beyond that. Again, there's still a lot of influences and a lot of, especially now with climate issues, there's just everything is like open to speculation. But I deal with individual landowners, and so I have to deal with their ownership. And within that ownership, there are stands, aggregates of trees that are of a certain species or species mix and a certain size range. And there's different ways to classify those into stands. So for forestry and foresters, the stand level is kind of always the basic level that we work at. And then in terms of the ownership itself, it's defined partly by what the landowner's goals and objectives are, what they want to achieve. If they have a timeline, they usually don't. And also by what the site and the forest is capable of. You can't, when somebody says to me, I want my forest to pay for my property taxes, and those property taxes include, the tax on their house. It's not going to happen. It's, unless you've got a really big forest, it's not going to pay the tax on your 250,000 or 300 or 400,000 or $500,000 or any amount of house. The forest can't do that. It can pay the taxes on the forest and then some, but it can't pay it on, these other amenities. So you have to be careful what we're asking of the forest. And most management plans are written on a 10-year horizon. I think it's a little short. We don't have, it's not like growth is that fast up here. If you're going to, probably doesn't mean much to most of you, but if a stand is stocked at what's considered adequate stocking level for growth and development of timber, called the B-line stocking, hardwoods are going to grow at about 2 square feet of basal area per year, and softwoods at about 3. That's site dependent. The better sites will grow more. So in 10 years, you're only adding 20 square feet. So if you're at 60 square feet, you're going to be 80 in hardwoods. If your softwoods are always stocked higher, if you're at 100 square feet of softwood, it's going to be 130. It's not moving up on that stocking, what we call the stocking chart, that much to to make any change in what you might do. So a 10-year horizon is pretty small. It's, again, what's commonly used. I like to look at 15, 20 years and also then try to project out from there. But you have to constantly be monitoring and adapting to whatever we're seeing for other influences.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is sort of my own follow-up question to that. When we're looking at plots of land that are 30, 50 acres maybe, or maybe 100 acres even, but they're part of a larger forest block that is owned by multiple owners. How does the different management from the different owners sort of affect the forest as a whole or the ecosystem there?
Yeah, it does, because obviously, anyone's forest, unless it's a fairly significant size forest, is influenced by what goes on around it. And the forest you know, it's the ecosystem is not confined to that ownership. It's a bigger, wider landscape thing. The difficulty for us as consulting foresters is that we don't necessarily work with all the abutters or any of the abutters. I've had situations where we've had a number of abutting forests and all linked together might be 1,000 or 1,200 acres. And that's great because there's a lot of advantages that you can have. People can work together to some degree on access. You know, it can have some efficiencies. But in terms of, we try to factor in what's going on and what the impact is on abutting forests, but I still have a responsibility to that landowner to try to meet their goals and objectives, as long as those are reasonable, as long as we're not, extracting more than the forest is capable of giving in a sustained way over some period of time. So it's a tough one. The landscape thing is a tough one. It's nice to work when you've got 2 or 3 or 4 or more forest landowners all together. It's really, it is nice because you can kind of set up a coherent, try to be coherent among all of those and inform one landowner what the other landowner's doing and vice versa, and that can really help. But
all right, we are at an hour, but we have a bunch more questions, and Ehrhard and I are happy to stay and answer some more, but just so everyone knows that it is 1 o'clock. The next question that I wanted to go to, I think, is a really interesting one. Brian asked, do you consider wood a renewable resource?
of course.
Do you want to elaborate?
It's certainly, it's a lot more renewable than cement. It's certainly more renewable than coal. But again, we can't ask too much. You can't expect more of anything than it can give sooner or later, because then you're mining, you're not managing. There's a difference. Mining we extract forest products when we're harvesting, and that should be done to accomplish certain goals and objectives, whatever those might be. It's still an extractive process, but mining is, like sooner or later you run out. We might run out on a given property because a small 40 or 50 acre ownership is very hard to economically manage in a way that will always have something of value there to cut. It's just very difficult in this day and age with the economics that are involved. But that doesn't mean it's not sustainable. It just means that, in a given ownership or a person's life, that, at a point you're going to run out of big trees to cut, or could. Or you might want to leave those big trees and just let them go their life cycle. So you're not going to cut them, but you've got a new forest developing, and that takes time.
Here is an interesting question from Michael Thomas. Is there any possibility of stopping beech bark disease? I recall Tom Wessel's holding out almost no hope for stopping the blight. What do you think?
What was that about?
Beech bark disease.
So I've been out with Tom Wessel. He's an interesting guy to be out with. Beech bark disease is pretty prevalent, and approximately the estimate that I heard is 5% of the beech are genetically resistant. They either don't get the beech bark disease at all, and it's not actually a disease. It's an insect disease complex. So they're either totally resistant and don't get it, or they aren't impacted very severely by it. I don't see any strategy that I know of that will work to decrease beech bark disease, and the only one that can possibly increase the resistance is to recognize and retain beech that have those characteristics that indicate resistance. So they don't have that pockmark, scaly, all over their bark. They're smooth, or they may have a little bit of a sign, but it never really proliferates on the stem. And so by leaving those, we can hopefully regenerate a greater portion of beech as resistant trees, and by removing the ones that are infected. And of course, the ones that are, when you cut beech sprouts prolifically, so that's another issue, but.
While we're on tree diseases, what do you think about the emerald ash borer and the reaction to that, of either cutting all the ash or waiting to see kind of what happens?
So we're on diseases, but emerald ash borer is an insect.
An insect.
It's really sad because ash is such a beautiful tree and such lovely wood. And my wife and I were down at the Louisville Slugger Factory Museum a couple of years ago, and I asked if they were worried about emerald ash borer and the impact on ash for bats, baseball bats. And they said no, and I was like incredulous. So they also use maple and yellow birch for bats, interestingly enough. I knew maple, but yellow birch was an interesting one. And so it's difficult though. There's been documented cases of mortality in ash down to 1 inch in diameter. I don't think that justifies cutting all the ash, but if you're a landowner and you have a significant volume of ash, it's worth a lot of money. Ash typically is a minor component of stands, 10% or less usually, but it can represent 20 or 25% of the volume just because of the form that tree has. It's typically taller than any other tree on the site, and it typically grows straighter, longer. But how do you as a manager or a landowner, and ash doesn't live forever, I mean, nothing lives forever, but ash is not a super long-lived tree. Beech used to be our longest lived tree, 300, 400 years. It's not anymore, it's 100, 150 years. So ash is that 125, 150 year range roughly. So when you're at 24 inches diameter in an ash tree, you're kind of there in terms of maturity. And how do you leave that and let that be killed by an insect and lose all that value?
Mm-hmm.
It's a dilemma. I mean, I don't, I'm not cutting all ash by any means or recommending that, but we're cutting ash much more heavily than we used to. So part of it also is that ash, again, it's, the forest is 45 years older than when I started working in this area. So, trees are older, they're bigger. You have to deal with that dynamic too. So it's a tough one though. I mean, I can't personally leave $250, $300 wood on the stump for 1,000 board feet and just watch it literally go up in smoke.
Makes sense. Barbara has asked, you mentioned the problem of invasive plants. In addition to glossy buckthorn and Norway maple, are there other trees you would consider invasive?
Oh, there's amber maple. We don't see that a super lot. We do see it in Hanover. You have glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, which, depending on where your cutoff is for trees or shrubs, they're certainly in that category. Your honeysuckles are always a shrub. Your barberry are always shrubs. Wingbark euonymus shrub. So yeah, I mean, I think basically you're looking at at your Norway maple and amber maple and the trees, and then, you know, semi-trees, you're looking at your buckthorns.
That Brian asks, following up on the wood as renewable and biomass, do you have a comment about Dartmouth deciding to turn away from the wood fuel for their power plant?
Who decided to turn away from wood fuel?
I think Dartmouth was going to have a wood fueled power plant and they decided not to.
Yeah, again, it's a dilemma. I followed that a little bit. There was also a plant in North Springfield that was proposed, a biomass plant that would both provide electricity and heat for the industrial park that I believe it was in. And the objection there was the number of trucks, the truck traffic. I would venture that the volume of truck traffic for schools that use wood to heat with, or for Dartmouth, if they chose to do that, would be way less than a plant that's running full tilt boogie all the time to generate power. It gets to the, again, oil, fracking and the creation of gas from that process or whatever other product, oil from wherever we get it around the world and the impacts that has, the tar sands. It seems to me that if we can utilize, the closer that we can access our energy sources, the better off we all are. That said, you have to be careful that all of a sudden we don't turn the forest into just, grow it and mow it in 30 or 40 years because it's just a fuel source now. I think we have to be really careful of that. But so again, it's all kinds of dilemmas. That market for biomass fuel, markets for pulpwood, markets for roundwood, firewood, whatever, are all tools or all markets that help us improve the forest, or should. They're not always applied the way they could or should be, but they should. And without those, then you can't economically extract a tree that has no value otherwise. And you can only girdle so many of those trees. I have a job in Stratford where every bit of wood that has been produced has been whole tree chips. It's all old field, multi-stem pasture pine. And there is and it's marginal now. It was purchased when the prices were up. So unfortunately, the contractor's kind of locked in. He's been honorable enough to do that job and not walk away because it's not viable at this point. But we couldn't treat that stand any other way. And the landowner used to do some work for a forestry contractor. Well, we could go girdle all those trees. I said, yeah, we could. You want to girdle 400 trees per acre, 300 trees per acre, and have those trees dying, and you couldn't walk in the forest for the next 25 years. So again, your forest becomes inaccessible. We need a certain amount of woody material on the ground for sure, for many, many reasons, but we need to have, in some cases, the markets for this lower quality wood in order to get any improvement. I'm not so concerned about the wood that's in the top of the trees above portions that might have some quality of logs in there. But those individual stems, there's just sometimes, in the way stands develop and the way past management has been treating the forest, you have, in order to move the dial on both better timber quality as well as healthier stands and more resilient stands in terms of climate change and the impacts, we really need those options.
A comment and a question from Jason. Jason comments that Scotch pine can also be invasive in some places, but isn't nearly as common as Norway maple or glossy and common buckthorn. So there's that statement. But his question is, what advice would you give to a young forester who's starting out now?
So the question is regarding invasives and a young forester starting out?
Oh, no, I think Jason was just adding on to adding that Scotch pine can be invasive also, to the question about invasives. And then his question was, what advice would you give to a young forester who's starting out now?
Maybe another profession. I don't know. It's a tough one. I mean, what's happening is that, our forests are under assault in so many ways. Insects, diseases, the climate, the whole, there's pine canker, which is a relatively new fungus that impacts white pine. The wet springs and early summers that we've had a lot recently. Some of you may have heard about all the needle blights and needle casts. They're affecting forest health. Our forests are constantly getting chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces, which makes them more challenging to work in economically anyway. I mean, we can do anything, it just costs money. So, but it's, what I like about it is, and what I've found satisfying, is that I've worked with a number of landowners for a long period of time now, and I've seen the changes in their forests, seen the changes in each of us personally as well. But I've seen those changes. I've been in those forests in all seasons, so that's always interesting. And it's not like a cookie cutter job where you're just doing one thing all the time. You've got inventory work and assessment work. You've got, planning and designing a harvest. You've got invasive control. You've got tending young stands. You've got boundary work. You've got access and road trail construction and building and design. So it's very, and then you've got report writing, and then you've got doing things like coming to the UBLT office and getting on Zoom. So, so you can't ever get stuck in a rut. So I don't know. I mean, I thought that there would be a lot more foresters and a lot more demand for foresters and other resource related jobs back when I was in high school. When I was in high school, it was the first Earth Day, and it's like, where are we? It's like, how many years later? Was it 50 years for the Earth Day recently?
Yeah, last year.
It's like, I don't know.
All right, I've got 3 more questions in the chat that we're going to go over, and I'm going to put out a last call. If anybody has a burning question they want to put in, we'll try to get to that too.
It looks like there are 22 up here, it says on the chat. 22
oh yeah,
questions.
I've gone through a lot of them.
Is that homework for me?
Only if you want it to be. All right, so William Maloney asks, are forest products currently being moved back and forth to Canada? And I think that might be a pandemic question, since the borders are closed.
So is it about work or moving wood to Canada?
Yeah, I think he's asking if there are wood products moving back and forth between the United States and Canada.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. No problem. That stuff's, I guess, tourist trade is not, tourist travel is not allowed, but commercial travel is. So yeah, wood's going back and forth to Canada all the time. Sure.
Okay.
And thankfully too. I mean, I'd rather have those markets closer, but we don't. We've lost a lot of those markets. The sawmill business has become, it used to be large sawmills, medium sawmills, and small sawmills, and the small ones were scattered all over the place. And that mix, like anything else, there's the more diversity, the more people you have out there, the stronger that economy is, and you know, the more you can access that locally. But again, we've lost a lot of those mills that, you know, were small mills that sawed for the landowner, the homeowner, and so now a lot of that wood goes to Canada.
Mhm. Michael Thomas asks, any thoughts about the emerging movement of pro-forestation, which I don't know what that is. Do you know what that is, Ehrhard?
What organizations?
Pro-forestation, and maybe if Michael is still on this call, he could tell us what that means.
I don't really know, other than that I attended a virtual meeting with, I think, the Green Mountain Club in regard to biomass fuel and falsity in its argumentation about sustainability. And they have a follow-up on this movement called reforestation. In fact, they have a meeting on Zoom coming up with Dr. William Mumma on Wednesday, the 24th. I'll put a link in the chat to that. And so what I assume, it's probably giving the forest a rest, but I don't know anything more than that. So I thought you would, Gerhard.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Michael. So we do need to give the forest a rest, and at times, and you know, the conditions and the site out there dictate, you know, kind of what is and what isn't appropriate, or you know, for a rest. And you know, I'd rather have typically a longer entry interval than a shorter one. Though that said, sometimes when you let too much time pass, your options can narrow. And that has to do with just, you know, the condition and the biology of the particular species you might be working with, how they develop and grow. But in terms of reforestation, I mean, our Northeast forests are incredibly resilient. I mean, even if they are spanked really hard, they typically will come back with regrowth, natural regrowth. We don't need to plant. I've planted, people plant, we can plant sometimes for various reasons, but they, you know, they will typically regenerate themselves and grow very well and very vibrantly. Even with the deer issue, there are ways to overcome that, and that's basically provide so many numbers that, you know, there's some for them to eat and some that can continue to grow. That takes sometimes larger cuts, believe it or not, in order to make that happen, not smaller ones, because anyway. So I don't particularly see the need to undertake huge planting programs. I think there's some benefit to occasionally plant some species that may be in the minority now, but are predicted to compose a greater portion of our stands in the future as the climate warms. I mean, for instance, I went around with someone in town and collected a yogurt container full of acorns, and I went around my place and I took a short little pry bar and opened up a little hole and stuck an acorn in and tamped it back over and just scattered them around in my woods. I have 2 5-gallon buckets of acorns that I need to now scatter that I got from somebody else. But again, it's the Northeast forest is very vibrant, very resilient, doesn't grow fast, but it does grow.
All right, Shannon wants to know if you have a favorite tree or species of tree.
I do. I have a favorite softwood and a favorite hardwood. And surprise, surprise, they are not commercially valuable species, which is kind of interesting. So my favorite softwood is tamarack or eastern larch. I just love that tree. it's so cool that it's an evergreen, but it's not. It loses its needles. It turns a beautiful golden color in the fall. And my favorite hardwood is black ash, which is the tree that is used by basket makers, native basket makers and non-native basket makers, to make ash baskets and splints. It's a magical wood. When you debark it and you pound the bark, pound the tree will separate along its annual rings to create these splints, and then those splints actually can be divided to finer and finer thicknesses. It's a really cool tree. So yeah, those are my two favorites. Outside of that, I like white pine and red oak too.
Those are great answers. All right, this is going to be our last question, and this is from George, who is asking about climate change and the loss of the sugar maple and the effects that would have on the maple syrup and the tourist industry in Vermont. And he's just asking for comment, but I think I would add, you know, how fast is this happening, and are we going to lose all of our sugar maples, most of our sugar maples? What do you think the future holds in your crystal ball?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, that it's a concern, especially to people in the sugaring business, and it's also an interesting dynamic if you think about it. You know, there's been a huge element of investment in sugar maple stands, typically forest stands, which aren't necessarily the best suited for sap production, but people have bought up huge tracts of land in I don't know about New Hampshire, but certainly in Vermont, northern Vermont especially, and some perhaps over in New York State. And, you know, they've huge commitment to producing maple. What's going to happen? It's don't know. It's not like flipping a switch, you know, with climate change and our species composition. I've seen more bitternut hickory and more white oak to some degree, and certainly more red oak over the last 15 or 20 years than what I remember years ago. And again, I think it's reflective of a generally warming climate, and you know, things are migrating, conditions are becoming more conducive to some species and less so to others. Species have a wide range. You know, paper birch is transatlantic. It goes all the way across the continent. Sugar maple goes all the way down the Appalachian chain and all the way up through north to south. But all those species have a sweet spot. They have an area where the climate, the soils, everything is right for them. And in those sweet spots, trees are always going to be healthier, more productive, perform better, whatever, than at the margins of their range. They're always going to be, at the margins, they're always going to be marginal. I have a lot of balsam fir at my place. It is not predicted to do well over the long term. But does that mean Ehrhard's going to go in and whack every balsam fir tree on his property that can be anywhere from 10 to 30 years old and start over? I don't think so. I also have a little microclimate regime there where we're in a basin, so it's always going to be cooler there. The cold air falls, and that's going to be, those lower elevations are always going to be cooler, even if it's warmer than it has been. So, you know, it's going to be a gradual evolution. How long it's going to take for you know, sugar maple to not be so viable, to not grow as quickly and heal over those tap wounds, and to be more susceptible to issues, I don't know. But it's not going to be like flipping the light switch. I do know that.
All right. Well, thank you, Ehrhard, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone who has asked questions and been here with us today. I want to tell you guys, we have 2 more of these Lunch and Learn series coming up on March 18th and April 15th. The March Lunch and Learn is about the geology and sediments of Smith Pond in Enfield. And on April 15th, we're talking about how to use the iNaturalist app to discover species. So I'm putting that information in the chat, and you can find it on our calendar page, uvlt.org/calendar. And yeah, so thank you all for coming. Ehrhard, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Allison, for putting all this together. I know it's a lot more time and effort than, you know, the time that we've just spent on this session. Also, Paul, for doing the video and all the editing. Did a great job. Obviously, some challenges with the wind and the sound sometimes, but and Jason, always good to get out with you and you know, discuss things in the forest. Appreciate your quest for knowledge and your sponge-like you know, personality in that regard. So anyway, and thanks, you know, Jeannie and everybody else at Upper Valley Land Trust for the opportunity. I hope people have learned something, and it's always an interesting exercise for me as well. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. That went pretty good, I think, eh?
Yeah, I think so. We had a lot of really good questions, I thought.
It might be interesting to take all the questions that were answered and asked and not, and perhaps, I have to be careful about this because of time constraints, but maybe pick some and periodically I could write a little something and you could stick it in some Upper Valley Land Trust publication or e-publication or whatever.
Oh, sure. I'd love that.
I don't want to commit to like every month or, but you know, maybe as time allows, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that'd be great. We could put it on our website or our e-news, or our website and our e-news, or you know, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
I think that would be good. I just saved all the questions from this so that we could use that again.